Open frame baseboards? What's that all about? Hi, welcome back to Chadwick Model Railway. I'm Charlie. Now hopefully a couple of weeks ago you saw the video, I think it was 119, where I laid the track, and since then I've wired it all up back into the controllers, and I've wired it up into 2 power districts. And the reason for the 2 power district is these sidings here, which are fiddle yard east 1 to 8, is in 1 power district, whereas the fiddle yard west will be on the other. And this is the line coming out of fiddle yard west to go up to into the Helix. If you're into block detection, that means that these 3 blocks here, zones B, C and D, are on one feed, whereas zone A will be on the other. Just temporarily, they're all botched together with the wiring just to get everything running, to make sure everything works. And hopefully you can see everything is kind of labelled up. So take this one, which is FE9, which is fiddle yard east, line 9, 6, 5, 4, and so on and so forth. So if I do get a wiring snag, hopefully I can sort it out. And then just to the left, and there's all the returns from all the cables coming back in again. And that's how I complete the bus wiring on this end of the fiddle yard. It's a little bit of a hodgepodge going back up into the Digitrack system with a few cables just to make it run, just so I can carry out this bit of testing. Now, as you can see on the far side, I've got a Western, and it's actually hooked up to 11 coaches. And that's the sort of maximum number I'm planning on running around the layout. This Western can pull these 11 coaches at speed 50 up the Helix without too much of a problem. But as you've noticed, alongside the Western, I've placed a rope. And this is a tip that I picked up from McKinley Railway, one of David Townend's excellent layout down on the south coast, because now I know that this rope is 11 coaches and a loco long. I can then run this out wherever I want on the layout to size up if the sidings are going to be long enough or whatever. And also I can then mark it off, say for the length of an HST unit or an 8 coach train. So it's a useful little asset, and thank you, David, for allowing me to use your little measuring device, let's say. As you can see here, the back scene now looks a little bit strange, but rest assured there is a cunning plan, and that is the fact that as the viaduct will come back up here shortly, there then becomes a hillside that runs up here and then comes back down into what will be a representation of Barnstable Station. So I'll just send off this Western onto the Helix, speed 50. So that's at half speed, and it seems to manage the Helix reasonably well. It doesn't seem to stop. So now when I do these tests, I need to establish really which locos needs which speed to get up the Helix in one go, as it were, without any hiccups. So it's just a case of trying, you know, all the locos one after the other, really. What of course I can't do is test the down line at the moment, because I really need the line coming from the viaduct and then to join up with the Helix so I can test locos going down. As you can see, with the 11 coaches, it's a fair old train, and I suppose it's fair to say that with the 12th coach it would sort of overlap itself. Does that make sense? I think you know what I mean. Then at the top of the Helix, as usual, there's a piece of dead track to stop the whole thing careering off. Now as I set it off going back in the other direction, this is where you start to notice some problems with the Helix. It's not actually with the Helix, but it's with these dreadful tension lock couplings. Because what's happening is they're tending to ride up each other and therefore derail the coaches. So what's the way around this? Well, I think it's the easiest thing to do is either use the Bachmann hose type couplings, which is hard wiring then the coaches together, as it were, because they are locked in, or of course to use a magnetic coupling such as the ones from West Hill Wagon Works. So now of course we just need to refit the viaduct. Well, there it is back in place, and as you can see the gap here is really quite minimal, but at least you can get your hands in there, and there's no points in this area, so it'll make it much more easier to service. As you can see here, the legs for the viaduct are bolted on the outside, and I really wanted them flush. So what I've done in the meantime now is I've actually removed those and then bolted them in line so that they're absolutely solid, and also again with M8 coach bolts I bolted them through into the frames of the fiddle yard. I've also removed the track that connects onto the viaduct because this was never that smooth. So what I'll do is I'll just relay a new track here and here to make sure that there are no dog legs, and I do need to raise this board just by a couple of millimeters, and I'll just chock it up on the wall and just lift it up a shade, and I'll do this bit once I've finished on the other side of connecting up to the Helix. I'm sure that I've mentioned it in the past, but when I had to remove the viaduct scenery, using these push-fit chocolate block connectors made it so much easier. Rather than starting to unscrew and remove cables, it just unplugged them and just moved the whole thing out of the way. And before we kick off, I've removed all the rolling stock from the Helix and from this board here, and obviously I've done away with the Digitrax controller that was here. I'll leave these bits in situ here, and now what I've got to do is to build the open plan baseboard, which is basically longitudinal frames and cross members to give support then for vertical members to come up on which to lay the track bed. And the reason I'm going for this option, I've never tried it before, and it's an interesting sort of evolution to look into, but because there will be a rise up into the Barnstable station, and there'll also be a fall as the other two lines join up with the Helix. And hopefully here you can see on the track plan how those lines were designed by Lee for me to instigate. So I'll just mention the materials I've got to hand. I've got 4 strips of this 18mm pot ply, which I so use for obviously these 2 longitudinal pieces, which I've put in with clamps at the moment to try to judge the right height. And then I can also cut the others up then into cross members. I've also got some 12mm ply strips which I can use for the uprights, or perhaps more cross members to get the risers up. And then fortunately yesterday, the day before the latest lockdown, I happened to be driving past B&Q, which if you're not British then it's kind of a DIY store, B&Q, and I bought a couple of sheets of this 9mm ply, and then this is what I intend to use really for the track bed. So the 2 lines will come off here towards the Helix, and then the other lines will go up towards Barnstable Station, and then I'll jiggle this around a bit, cut a centre section out of it, and then hopefully it will give me some movement within the board then to sort of bring in the curves. But there we are. So I'll set about this. I'm not going to film all of this because I'm sure you've got better things to do with your lives than watch me drill a few holes and put some cross members in. I thought I'd put a cross member every foot. So I'm just using a little offcut just to mark up where the cross members will be, so I can then drill holes through, countersink the other side, and then screw the cross members in. That'll be the phone then. I found the easy way of doing this is just to offer them up and go for it, rather than trying to put them vertically on the floor or try to support them with clamps. It's just a case of whack it in. Right, so with all the battens in place, we end up with like a matrix of chambers, and then if my calculations are to be believed, it should kind of drop over these vertical studs. Well, you need two people, really, isn't it? And then I should be able to fit these MH coach bolts and then once tightened we should have a good rigid matrix, if you like, to build our supports for the track bed. So this box section now is all in and bolted, and should there be any flex in it I could always bolt it to the wall, but I don't really think that will be necessary. So now it's a time for a bit of maths. Quite surprisingly, the rise from the Helix to this next board with the Viaduct is going to be a 1 in 32. Now that clearly isn't a small undertaking for any locomotive, let's say. There are a couple of things I can do to change this, and that is I can easily add another layer to the Helix but reduce the height between each layer. Therefore the Helix will be a little higher but flatter in itself, but which obviously then lead to a lighter rise coming up here. I don't particularly want to do that, and it may have ramifications that if I make the Helix higher, then running up into the Barnstable station will mean that this line here will have a steeper climb. So it's a kind of a juggling match, really. There is one other thing that Lee came up with, and that is what I could actually do is jack up the whole of the Helix and the end of this board here, the one with all the points on, is just put a 1-inch block underneath and lift the whole thing up. The flex would be taken up at this joint here, but there are no points or whatever on this join, and it would just mean that one of the boards will have a 1 in 72 climb on it, that board there, because it's 6 foot long, put up 1 inch, there we are, the easy maths. So that sort of makes sense. So what I'm going to do now, I think, is using an old strip of 12mm ply, is I shall work out exactly how this run will go that goes to the Helix. I'm not going to do the Barnstable run first. Now, maths, and I'll try to stick to metric. This is 925mm off the floor, and the Helix is 845 where it comes off, and I'm going to branch it out onto here, which leaves 80 centimetres. It's 2.5 meters long, and cutting to the chase, every 312 millimeters we need to drop down 10, which is actually your 31, 1 in 31, 1 in 32. So you need to drop down 10 mil. So what I've got is a lot of clamps. So I'm going to cut up some timber strips and put them in place to step it down, just to see what it looks like before I sort of go cutting up the 9mm ply and put it in situ. So I shall use the 12mm offcuts and try to keep it 3mm high, if that makes sense, because obviously I'm going to use 9mm, and see how it goes. So I'll start to chop up a few bits of timber and then clamp them into place. When I'm satisfied, I'm not going to screw them. I've bought some M6 coach bolts to bolt them through, so that it should be reasonably easy to adjust them up and down. We'll see how that goes. Now, it's not going to come as a surprise to you that I've had a little rethink on the maths. Nothing's changed, but rather than talking about floor distances and all the rest of it, from the top of this baseboard, which is horizontal, it's 123mm to the bottom of where the 9mm track bed should be at the start. So if I've got to drop 10mm every 312mm, then it's simply a case then of measuring up from this this board here the distance required. So that one's at 123, so therefore this one must be 113, and it's clamped in. One thing that's clearly crucial is to make sure that these things are horizontal before I screw or bolt them in. And then all I've done is knocked up a load of T-pieces, so I shall work my way along the board with the T-pieces and see how the track bed will shape up. So let's knock a few of these up. You can never own enough clamps, in my mind. Of course, I've got to be very careful here, because if the clamps drop underneath here, and all those, those 7 points are underneath. You can lose that now. Okay, now this is where it starts to take a slight turn through here, and obviously this one needs to come up. We now have the first supporting batten by the Viaduct module, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 battens in place. Moving up to the other end for the solution of how it joins to the Helix, and I've got a piece of timber that will come along here, and then once this is in place with another couple of supports, and then the track bed will veer off this main frame and join up to the Helix. It's now worth offering up a piece of ply, and I've trimmed down this upright. If I push this piece in there so it's flush with this edge, and hopefully you can see then the angle doesn't appear to be too severe. Viewing from the other side, as luck would have it, we have a supporting member under here, so obviously the next piece of timber we can secure it into this piece of timber, so we get more of a secure flow through the boards. Now, before we go any further of the lines coming down, it's worth turning our attention to the Helix. And this Helix, in this last quarter, I want to change it so that we take off the last 1/8 of this turn. And the reason for that is because if we come off that 1/8, I'll need to make a pretty sharp turn to get back onto this board. And as you can see, this is forming an S-bend. Now, S-bends on the real railway are bad enough, but on a model railway they can be dreadful. So it's always best when you come off one curve to run straight before you go the other way, and make them as less severe, that's not the right term, is it? But make them as gentle as possible. So to that end, I'm going to cut these back, and then these tracks will run straight, and then they'll make this slow curve as they rise up the hill. Of course, you've got to think about the scenic side of what actually is going on here, because the Helix is hidden. There will be a station over the top of it. So these tracks must come from somewhere. So they're going to come out of a tunnel mouth, and the tunnel mouth should be around this area here. So as they emerge from the tunnel mouth, there will be some kind of a retaining wall or embankment to segregate it from the Barnstaple station area, which will come up here. So we'll have this disparity of levels, so it'll look more kind of three-dimensional, and then the two tracks will run up this board, then up to the top, coming into those points by the viaduct, where there'll obviously be a signal to hold the up line to make sure that the viaduct is clear prior to a train coming up. And similarly, coming the other way, the trains would be held the other side of the viaduct. Hopefully that all makes sense. So before I start sawing up these boards, I want to run these T-pieces right through to join up to here to make sure the levels are exact, and then using the old 12mm strips of ply, I can size it up to make sure it's right, and then we can cut up this board and lay this in. I won't actually lay the board in permanently because I need to lean over and start thinking about the rise up here, and that will inhibit my access into Barnstaple. But at least then we can hook up a train or two perhaps, and run up just to do the test runs to make sure that the angle of rise is good to go. Well, I won't bore you to death with me cutting up more T-pieces and bits of ply and nailing them in place. The next time you can may well be a how-to, but after that I'll certainly have connected this all up and be running trains from here, both down and out of the Helix, to test the levels to make sure it works properly. So hopefully you'll join me then. In the meantime, of course, I'd like to thank my patrons and the people who donate to the channel, and there should be a link there. Please don't forget to subscribe, and there should be a video here and here. Please stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.